Talking today to Sarah Murray, who is the author of Making an Exit, which is a book about how we celebrate the dead. Sarah, tell me, how did you become interested in these rituals that we have around saying goodbye to our departed loved ones?
It's not something I'd thought a lot about, actually, to be honest. And it was really my father's death that prompted this. He'd been a lifelong atheist and somebody who had always been very matter-of-fact and about life. We didn't really celebrate very much altogether as a family, and we didn't really engage in formal rituals. And then when he died, he made some very interesting decisions about what he wanted to do with his remains, which came as a complete surprise to me. So it was his...
He issued a set of instructions, didn't he?
Very specific, actually. I mean, it was a great surprise because he had always said, oh, you know, take me off in a cardboard box or a plastic bag or, you know, whatever's most practical and hygienic. And we said, well, that's fine, but can you please write that down? Because we were a little bit worried. He was a very popular man, and we worried that people would wonder why we weren't having a funeral for him. And so we said, that's fine, put it on a piece of paper. When we came to open it, it was this very, as you say, very, very specific set of instructions on where he wanted his ashes scattered in a churchyard near where his two best friends were buried. And I just thought, well, this is interesting because for somebody who always said, you know, my remains will be organic matter when I'm gone, suddenly he was now thinking about his remains as being next to where his best friends were buried. And to me, that was a very significant change in his philosophy because it meant he was actually, you know, before he died, he'd obviously been thinking about his remains and what should happen to them after he died. So it got me thinking about my own death, and then I've always been a great traveller, so I just thought, well, this is, you know, I've got to go and see what other people are doing. So it really sort of set me off on this great long journey.
And where did the journey take you? What are the different places that you went in search of funeral rituals, as it were? I
went all over the place, actually. I went to Latin America, so I went to Central America. I went to Mexico for the Day of the Dead festival, which of course is an absolutely incredible thing. I went to Hong Kong for the annual burning of the ritual sort of offerings for the dead. I went to Bali for the most incredible royal cremation, which was perhaps one of the most spectacular things that I saw. I went to Ghana to actually commission my own coffin, which was quite an interesting experience. So I was travelling probably for about a year and a half, you know, on and off the road most of that time.
Let's come to Ghana, because in Ghana they make the most spectacular coffins.
Absolutely,
describe those to us.
Well, I first saw them in a newspaper article, and I thought, well, if I'm writing a book about how we send off the dead, I have to go and see these things, because basically in Ghana you can have any shape, form, whatever you want, from a giant Coca-Cola bottle to an aeroplane as your coffin. And in Ghana they relate to people's lives very much. So, you know, the planes tend to be for pilots, giant vegetables for farmers, fish for fishermen. I remember seeing a sack of flour that was for a miller. There were beer bottles, which I wasn't quite sure whether they were brewers or alcoholics. But, you know, really, and also relating to your life. So a lot of people had very aspirational ones, like a Mercedes and that sort of thing. So, and they struck me as so incredibly colourful and a thing that just didn't...
Did anybody have mobile phones?
Oh yes, absolutely. There were mobile phones. A lot of contemporary objects.
Yeah.
But, you know, all done in these fantastic colours, very flamboyant, very celebratory, and they get paraded through the village at the funeral.
And beautifully produced.
Beautifully produced, with great care. I mean, they're very skilled craftsmen, the people that do it. And I thought, well, this is very unlike anything I've ever thought of being associated with death. So I went off to Ghana and found a coffin maker and got my own commissioned.
And what shape is yours in?
Well,
I
had a lot of time thinking about it, because I thought, well, I'm a writer, so, you know, somebody said to me a computer mouse, and I thought, well, you know, that's really boring. And a pen is just not very, given their sort of creative skills, it's rather boring. And so I just went for the aspirational favourite object, which is the Empire State Building, which is my favourite building in the whole world. And I actually took a little model, a little pewter, tourist model, so that because my coffin maker, as I like to say, had never seen the Empire State. He didn't know what the Empire State Building was, so I took a postcard so that he could see it in situ, and I took a little model, which of course he could very easily copy.
So what colours is it in?
Well, that was an interesting question, because when I went over there with the little pewter model, he said to me, well, what colours do you want? And I said, well, if we painted it in a sort of pewter grey at a sort of 6 or 7 foot, whatever it was, it's going to be a bit dull and depressing. So I said, well, why don't you just do it in Ghanaian colours, choose whatever colours you want, and it'll be a true Ghanaian coffin. When it came to it, he really wanted instructions. He did not want to ad-lib, he wanted me to say exactly. So I was looking around my apartment for some colours to inspire him. And there's a great, I have a huge abstract painting by a great friend of our family's. I grew up with this painting actually. I'm very fond of it. I was very fond of the man who painted it. We had a very sort of special relationship when I was growing up. And so I just took a picture of this painting, and I thought, well, he can pick out some of the purples and the turquoises and the blues, and there's a lovely red in it somewhere. Anyway, when I got the coffin, it was absolutely, I couldn't believe what I was seeing, because there was the painting replicated on the coffin, to the extent that if I had seen that coffin somewhere in a shop, I would have gone, hang on a minute, that's Kit's painting.
Yes.
So in a way, to me, it was just that it made the whole thing so much more meaningful, because suddenly here was my family's great friend commemorate, a Ghanaian coffin painter on the other side of the world was replicating this painting painted in the 60s by a great friend of the family. So the whole thing was just, it was extraordinary.
And in other parts of the world, they do very different things. In Hong Kong, they make up gifts to send the dead away with. So what are they?
Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing. There's so much creativity involved in this, so much craft work. In Hong Kong, the tradition is that every year you go and you sweep the graves once a year, and you bring offerings, often of food, drinks and that sort of thing, but at the same time you also bring paper objects to burn. And the idea behind those is that when you burn those objects, they go into the afterlife, so that people in the afterlife can use these objects. So really you're creating a great wealth and richness and material happiness for your ancestors. And what's lovely about that is being typically Hong Kong materialistic, uber modern. It used to be paper money and paper, clothing and traditional hats and that sort of thing. Now, of course, it's mobile phones and cardboard. I believe there's even a cardboard iPhone, a cardboard iPad. When I was there was a shop I came across which had 3 different sizes of flat screen TV made out of cardboard. My favourite, which I actually bought, was an iron, because of course you've got to keep your clothes ironed in the afterlife.
Right.
But it's a hilarious sort of, when you see these objects, it's a very funny, and you laugh a lot, and I think the Hong Kong Chinese enjoy it a lot. But also it struck me there's a sort of more serious point about it, which is that there's, I found in a lot of the rituals that I saw this very powerful need for us to somehow connect with people in the afterlife. So passing on gifts is a very powerful way of doing that. And the Hong Kong version of this, in these objects that we use every day, that they burn them and you can imagine them going off into the afterlife and being used. I mean, it struck me as this very sort of powerful connection. And actually there was a really poignant moment when I was at one of the big cemeteries watching this happen, because it was a very celebratory mood. Everybody's having picnics, the kids are running around screaming, people are talking on their mobile phones, and inside one of the places where all the niches, where there's millions, sort of rows upon rows of urns with these little faces of people's ancestors on, there was a woman, and she was kneeling in front of one of these urn niches, and she was on her mobile phone, and I thought, she was very sort of savvily dressed and modern looking, and there she was tapping away on her mobile phone, and I thought, typical, nobody's got any respect for the dead anymore. And what I realised was, after a while I stood there and I watched her, and I realised she was actually going through her phone and she was finding a picture, and the picture was her newly born grandson, When she found it, she turned it to face the photographs
and she
on
was
the
showing it
image,
to...
and she was explaining, look, here's your new great-grandchild.
Yeah.
And so again, it was this sort of extraordinary connection between, you know,
a mixture of modern
digital
technology
photograph and two little ceramic photographs sort of talking to each other across time. I mean, it was very moving, actually.
What was the most unusual funeral ritual you came across, do you think, in the course of doing it?
I think one of the most unusual burial sites I came across, and then when I was there discovered rituals as well, was in the Philippines, in a tiny little mountain town called Sagada. And there they hang the coffins in caves and crevices and caverns. It's a very rocky limestone area. I think partly because burial is quite difficult there, there's not a lot of soil. And partly because there's a sort of security thing and you can, you know, get the dead out of reach. But so you see these extraordinary cliff faces with sort of ranks of coffins hanging on them. So I thought, well, I've got to go and see that. But actually when I ended up spending a couple of weeks there, and what I got out of it was a lot more than just seeing these coffins, because I discovered there was a whole very, very powerful community sort of rituals around death. So the whole village turns up for a funeral. In fact, when I was there was a funeral happening, and of course I was very intrigued, and I said to somebody, you know, the person who told me knew I was researching this book, and said, you can go if you want to. And I said, well, you know, are you sure? I didn't feel like intruding on somebody's funeral. She said, oh, no, I mean, you know, if you don't go in the village, there's, you know, people raise an eyebrow. And so I went along, and there was an all-night ritual for this old lady who died, and there she was laid in a coffin. But what was fascinating about it was that this is an Anglican, very small Anglican part of the Philippines, which is mainly Catholic.
Yeah.
But they'd escaped the influence of the Spanish when they were there, because they were headhunters.
Right.
And the Spanish were rather too scared to go up there. And when the Americans had taken over, they had brought Anglicanism with them, and this had been adapted, helped by the fact that actually they explained Jesus was buried in a cave, so that sort of chimed with the traditional rituals. And so now they have this extraordinary blend of the original religions, that the sort of animist religions that they followed, and Christianity. So the woman in that I saw, whose funeral I attended, she was in a sort of Christian-shaped coffin with a little figure of Jesus on the cross at her head. But she was buried in these very detailed burial robes, which were absolutely down to the right, details for the tribal rituals. And during this all-night vigil, everybody was chanting songs, but it went from Anglican hymns to tribal rituals without sort of seamlessly.
Yes.
You know, there was no sense that this was an odd thing.
Yeah.
And so it just fascinated me that there was this sort of extraordinary blend of two cultures that sat together very happily.
Sarah, thanks for talking to me today.